This is a Z3000 oscillator from TipTop Audio. Let's check it out. I'll take the CV out of my MIDI interface and plug that into the 1 volt per octave input on the Z3000. I'll take the sine wave output and plug that into my VCA input. Then I'll take the output of the amplifier and plug that into my monitoring setup. Now I want to control this with my keyboard, so I'll take the gate output out of the MIDI interface and plug that into the gate input on this ADSR, and take the output of the ADSR and plug that into the CV input on my VCA. So now when I play on the keyboard, we can hear the sine wave output from the Z3000 oscillator. Let's hear this with a sequence. This is a frequency control dial. You can see the instantaneous value here. We can switch this from frequency to note to even octave. There is also a fine-tune control just below. Let's try a different output. This is the triangle output. This is a sawtooth. And lastly, this is the pulse output. For the pulse, we have pulse width control with this dial here. When it's all the way to the left, it's very thin but doesn't cut off completely. But all the way to the right, the sound completely cuts off. So if I just play a single note, you can see and hear the change of the pulse width. At the center position, you get a pure square shape. Now if we go back to the sine output, the Z3000 also has a wave shaper input. So if I take a slow-moving sine wave LFO output and plug that into this wave shaper input, we can now modulate the shape of the sine wave. This also works for the triangle shape, but it doesn't work for the sawtooth or the pulse. Now this modulation can also go up to audio rate based on your incoming signal. So now we have audio rate wave shaping on the triangle shape. Same for the sine. So quite easy to get some harmonically rich waveforms out of this oscillator. Next, let's talk about frequency modulation. There are two inputs here, FM1 and FM2. Let's try FM input 1. This is an exponential FM input. Now there is no control for this modulation input, so you get the full range. But if you choose FM2, there is a FM2 depth control dial there. This can also go into audio rate. There's also a linear FM input, which is specifically meant for audio rate modulation. Now, to demonstrate this, I have two Z3000 oscillators. So I can take the sine waveform output from this Z3000 and have that as a source for the linear FM. The FM depth control works for the linear modulation as well. Let's try this on the sawtooth. Now right now my modulating oscillator is not being key tracked. There is no signal in the CV input. So I can just mult my CV input and have that go to both the Z3000s. So now that same CV input is controlling the pitch of both the oscillators. Let's just hear a sine wave for now. Alright, next let's talk about pulse width modulation. So I'll switch back to the pulse output. We can set the other Z3000 to low mode and have its sine wave modulate the pulse width on the first Z3000. Next, let's talk about the sync input. So we can take a sawtooth output from this Z3000 and plug that into the sync input on the first Z3000. And now we can control the pitch of the first Z3000 with the second one. So I can plug the CV input to the second oscillator. And since the first one is slave to the second, you can hear the pitch change. Keep in mind we're still listening to that first oscillator. We can also modulate the pitch of the slaved oscillator with maybe a slow-moving LFO. We will get that typical hard sync modulation tone. I'll plug it into the linear FM input. Set my LFO to slow, low rate. Increase the modulation depth. Let's just switch back to the exponential FM. I think that works better for hard sync. Let's try this with the pulse. So with this you can also get some pulse width modulation type effects. There we go. Now we have that typical oscillator hard sync screen tone. Now the Z3000 also has another sync option. This one is the hard sync modulation input. It's essentially the same thing, but gives you a slightly different output. You can use any source for the HSM input and still get a pretty interesting result. So that is the Z3000 oscillator from TipTop Audio. Stay tuned for more.